Hi there and welcome to this lecture about Sweden during the 18th century, also known as the Era of Freedom. My name is Marcus Henriksson and I'm a history teacher here in Sweden. So let's begin with the question, what characterizes the 18th century? Well, a lot of science and new discoveries. This is also known by many historians as the Enlightenment. We can see that science now began to attract more and more people instead of the church and the priests. In the year 1739, the Royal Academy of Sciences was founded and created here in Sweden, in the capital, Stockholm. Here are some famous Swedish scientists. Carl von Linné. He had a huge interest in nature, and he is also known as the father of Swedish botany. He mapped thousands of different animals and plants. Anders Celsius. He is mostly known for creating the Celsius scale. Christopher Polhelm, a Swedish inventor and also known as the father of Swedish mechanics. During this time, we also have a thing called imperialism, which is basically that several European countries now try to compete to conquer as much of the world as possible. We can also see a more global world than ever before. We traded more with each other, but also because we had a lot more colonies than ever before. Here in Sweden we have the East India Company, and they traded a lot with Asia and countries like China, India and the Philippines. They traded mostly with stuff like porcelain, tea, silk, etc. and spices of course from India and the Philippines. We can also see that the middle class basically took over this new Swedish society. They now became the dominant class. And we can see the first Swedish newspapers. Sweden was first in the world to have freedom of the press in 1766. During this time, Sweden had a queen, Ulrika Eleonora, on this picture here, and she was Charles XII's sister. And she decided that the dictatorship of earlier Swedish kings now was abolished. So the Swedish parliament gained a lot more control and power. During this time, we can see two really strong Swedish parties, the Hats and the Caps. The Hats were a young and modern party, while the Hats was a more traditional old party. The Hats wanted a new war, and they managed to take power here in Sweden in the year 1738. Many of the Hats were young military men. They wanted to take back what Sweden had lost from the previous wars. They thought that Sweden was in some ways superior to Russia and their military, which now was in some kind of political chaos. And in the year 1741 they therefore started a new war against Russia. But this was going to be a huge mistake. The Swedes' war on Russia was a total failure. The Russians had really learned their lessons from the earlier wars. They had adopted the Swedish tactics and had modernized the army so that when the Swedes encountered the Russians, well, the Swedes lost. And Sweden was now really close to losing Finland. For a long time it looked like the Russians could get and take the whole of Finland. The Finns even tried themselves to send a delegation to Russia and take the oath of allegiance to the Russian Empress Elizabeth. However, she refused. In Sweden, the people here were really angry, considering the fact that thousands of farmers marched from the valleys in 1743 demanding that Fredrik of Denmark instead now should take over the Swedish crown from Ulrika. However, it all ended with the military opening fire and at least 140 people died and thousands were arrested. The result instead was a peace treaty with Russia where Sweden lost basically nothing. But Ulrika Eleonora was to step down as a Swedish queen. Instead, in the year 1751, Sweden got a new king, the man in the picture here, Adolf Fredrik. However, the parliament in Sweden still had a huge power, which made him really angry. Because basically every king and queen in Europe had more power than the Swedish queen and the Swedish king, and they wanted to change this fact. Adolf Fredrik's wife, Louisa Ulrika, therefore planted a coup d'etat together with her husband to regain control of Sweden. But this coup failed, and instead those involved in this coup was beheaded. Except for the king and queen, they got away with a warning. Then Sweden went to war with Prussia, because Sweden at this time was allied with France and Austria. And Sweden was therefore forced into a war with Prussia in the year 1757. The war went basically to hell, but Sweden yet again managed to get some kind of peace treaty with Prussia without losing basically anything. In the year 1771, Olof Fredrik died. The reason, you might ask? Well, he had eaten too much. Mostly pastries. Sweden then got a new king, Gustav III. And now the time of freedom ended. Gustav III, like his father, wanted a monarchy again. He therefore made another coup d'etat, and this time it succeeded. But you should also know that he made some political reforms. Milder punishments, for example, for a bunch of various crimes. He prohibited torture. And he also banned people from making their own brandy and started to sell his own brandy instead, which made more money for the Swedish state and crown. But he was also known as a king who lived in the past. He reintroduced 17th century clothing, he didn't like science, and he also loved old art and theatre. And he detested the French Revolution. So he gave a Swedish general known as Alex von Fersen responsibility for an escape attempt where he was supposedly to try to get the French king and queen out of the country. But it all failed. You should also know that Alex von Fersen is supposedly to have an affair with the French queen, Marie Antoinette. They have written a bunch of love letters to one another. But a new plan was hatched. The French Revolution was not allowed to succeed according to the new Swedish king Gustav III. He therefore planted a new military offensive against Paris with 30,000 soldiers, and they would try together to free the French royal couple from their prison. But the security in France was too high, so the plans of this coup or attack was put on hold. He also bet on the slave trade. He bought a French island, Saint Barthélemy, and started his own slave trading company. But you should know for a fact that Sweden's part in the global slave trade was very small or little. Of a total of around 36,000 transport ships of slaves, only 16 were Swedish. He also started a new war against Russia, but yet again another failure. The people, and especially the nobility here in Sweden, were now really unhappy with the king. A series of noblemen therefore planned to assassinate the Swedish king, and their plan was to attack during a masquerade. He was then murdered in March 16, 1792 by a nobleman named Jakob Ankarström, who shot the king in the head. The people responsible was then found and executed. Sweden then got a new king, Gustav IV of Adolf, or Gustav IV Adolphus. He didn't like democracy, he didn't like the new French Emperor Napoleon. Russia attacked Sweden, and they had an alliance with France during this time, and therefore got the go-ahead from Napoleon to attack Sweden. Sweden, however, had Great Britain on its side, but had also a hard time considering the fact that Danes was also on the side of the Russians. Sweden therefore had to fight on two fronts at the same time. The last Swedish hope during this offensive was Sveaborgs fästning. This was Northern Europe's strongest fortress. Thousands of soldiers, thousands of cannons packed with food. But they gave up immediately when the Russian soldiers came. Why, you might ask? Well, there are different theories. Russian propaganda might have struck fear among the Swedish soldiers, but it could also have been that Sveaborgs fästning's Swedish commander, Admiral Karl Olof Kronstedt, had been bribed. Sweden, however, lost all of its territories in Finland. And you should know that Sweden had Finland for about 600 or 650 years. So with basically just this war, Sweden now lost 1/3 of the population and almost half of the Swedish territories in a single day. So now there was a coup d'etat against the Swedish king, Gustav III Adolf. He refused to capitulate, so the military therefore staged a coup, and they deposed him. After this, Sweden and Russia made peace. But yeah, Sweden lost Finland. A new form of government was then introduced. Power should in the future be shared between the king and the Swedish parliament. Autocracy is now over and the people's century now begins. So I hope during this lecture that you have gained some new knowledge about Sweden's history. The sources I've used for this video are History by Elisabeth Ivansson, Robert Sandberg and Mattias Tudaj, Perspective on History by Lars Hansen Örjan Nyström, History Documentary Swedish History by Martin Timell and Dick Harrison, Wikipedia Finnish War, SO-rummet.se, Adolf Fredrik, the king who ate himself to death. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment. I hope you have a nice evening. Bye.